Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring reincarnation and possession. With me is anthropologist Dr. James Matlock, who is the co-author with Erlander Haraldson of a recently published book called I Saw a Light and Came Here: Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. He is also a regular contributor to the online Psi Encyclopedia, sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in London. And he has created a course, an academic course on reincarnation called Signs of Reincarnation. It's, to my knowledge, the only academic course focusing exclusively on reincarnation. Welcome, Jim.
Good to be here, Jeff.
Pleasure to be with you. Now, to begin with, I know many of our viewers are going to have preconceived ideas about what we mean by possession, especially because the popular movies and are full of cases of what I would call hostile possession, but we're really not looking at that so much. So let's define possession as we're going to use it in this interview.
Okay. Yes, and parapsychologists tend to call cases like that demonic possession. And
Yeah.
I think, yes, you're right. I mean, for many people, possession is sort of equated with demonic possession, and it's not at all clear what that might have to do with reincarnation. Parapsychologists tend to think of possession slightly differently. Think of mediumistic possession, say, where a spirit, a communicating spirit, takes possession of the medium and transmediumship.
Yeah.
Or there are cases. One famous case of Lorenzi venom, say, which is a classic case.
Classic a great
case
one
of
to
possession,
get into.
A classic case of possession, where a girl, teenager, Lorenzi venom, began to have certain problems that she wanted to resolve.
In the town of Watseka, Illinois.
Watseka, Illinois, that's right.
Yeah.
It's south of Chicago. Was voluntarily left, and her personality was displaced by a different personality, that of Mary Roth,
a child who had died in the same town.
Died in the same, and was
years earlier, as I recall.
Yes, I haven't reviewed the case either very recently.
I think it's like 10 years
earlier. And it was only casually known to her family. It was known to her family, as I recall, but not very well known. Anyway, she took over and said that she had taken over Lorenzi's body to allow Lorenzi to get better. And she remained in possession for 13 weeks.
Yeah. As I recall this case, Mary Roth, the possessing spirit, had suffered a similar illness before she died.
Anyway, she remained in possession for 13 weeks only.
Yeah. Went to live with her
and she
her
went to,
own
yes,
family.
This is important, actually. Yes. And, this is typical of possession cases. She didn't identify herself as Lorenzi anymore. She identified herself as Mary, didn't recognize Lorenzi's parents, wanted to live with Mary's family, went to live with Mary's family.
And they accepted her.
And they accepted her because she recognized all of Mary's family and friends and possessions and so forth, and for all effects and purposes was Mary in Lorenzi's body.
Yeah.
But then after 13 weeks, Mary left, and Lorenzi returned.
And as I recall, she said, "Okay, I'm going to be going now." She announced.
That's right. Yes, I mean,
and there was announcing dreams as well, to my recollection,
involved in this.
Yeah.
So it's a very curious case that has overlaps and resemblances to the reincarnation cases in various ways, particularly through the dreams and through the behavioral identification, the identification through memories, the self identification, the first person.
It's sort of the archetypal parapsychological case of possession. Now, but I know you're an anthropologist, and anthropologists also use the term possession from time to time.
They do, because they're describing indigenous cultures, tribal cultures in which possession of the mediumistic sort can be very common.
And typically, as I recall, shamans will become entranced and possessed not by deceased individuals, but maybe by deities.
Or they're controlled spirits, as it were, as we might call them.
And they may go into a dance,
right,
for example.
Right. So this is sort of classical possession, outside of reincarnation context, with overlaps and parallels to what we see in the reincarnation cases.
Yes.
And yet, as in mediumistic possession, it's very short term, or shamanic possession, very short term, or in the Laurenzi Venom case, 13 weeks, but still limited. And then we come to cases of reincarnation that are more limited. But to come back to the definition of possession, in the types of possession that we've been talking about, the possession involves the displacement of one spirit by another spirit.
Right.
And for many people, that's what they think of when they think of possession. They think of the spirit of Jim being displaced by the spirit of Jim's deceased grandfather or something, or some demonic spirit taking over Jim's body. But that's not the only way we can think of possession, and that's not the only way to define it. We can think of possession simply as the possession of a body. Right? Which
is what the word literally means.
Yes, and without the connotation or the implication of replacement. And in that case, we can think of all reincarnation as possession. Right? It's just a possession that occurs early or sometime during the period of gestation, at any rate, before birth. So if we think of it that way, all reincarnation is possession.
Of a permanent sort.
Of a permanent sort,
yes, and not necessarily displacing any other spiritual entity.
Precisely. But, and this is what, the main topic of today is, right, is those cases, and there are these cases, that are like Laurenzi's case, in that there's a replacement of some duration. However, it's of longer duration, and in two cases that we know about, that we're able to follow to the ends of their lives, lasted to the end of the natural life of the person. And my term for these is replacement reincarnation.
Replacement reincarnation.
There are other terms that have been used for it, and it's Stevenson liked to call them anomalous date cases, because the date of the death of the replacing spirit or the possessing spirit was later than the birth date of the person.
So you're assuming that, therefore, once you're born, there must be some sort of a spiritual entity in possession that gets replaced.
I'm assuming that the subject of the case is born with one spirit in control of its body.
Yes.
And then at a later juncture, a different spirit comes in and replaces the spirit that was originally in control of the body and takes control of the body and persists in control of the body.
Right.
To the end of the natural life.
Right.
Now, there are a number of interesting characteristics of these cases. One is that typically they are associated with illness. So it's often a severe illness, so that the person actually seems to die and then revives with a different personality. Okay, as if the old spirit left actually, and the new spirit has taken possession. They also tend to happen when the subject of the case is young. You know, maybe only a few days, a few weeks, a few months old. In other cases like this, when they're that young, they really can't say anything. They have memories of, they can't speak of, of the memories. Sometimes when they become older, they do have memories, but not of their first years or first months, but of the previous life, of the person.
In other words, so the replacing spirit then grows a little older and begins to speak and has memories of having been another person who died after the present body was born. Right.
Well, the body is what becomes older.
Yeah.
And there are cases where the subject of the case is a little bit older. Around 3, there's several cases around 3. There are also some when they were teenagers.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So by age 3, the personality is well enough developed, and obviously is able to speak and so forth. And so in these cases, when replacement occurs after age 3, the new spirit coming in doesn't have to have any time to adjust. It doesn't need to. It immediately begins to claim to be another person, the deceased person. It calls itself by the deceased person's name, acts like the deceased person, recognizes things exactly like Mary Roth, except that here we're talking about a spirit,
a lifelong possession.
A lifelong possession.
Yeah.
But here we're talking, and typically about, and in all cases of this, I believe, of a spirit that was not known to the subject's family.
Okay. Now, in the New Age literature, I believe Ruth Montgomery, well-known spiritualist and psychic. I'm not sure if she was a medium as well, but she talked about walk-ins.
Walk-ins.
And that became a very popular term in New Age parlance. It seems to resemble this kind of replacement reincarnation.
It does, and that's still the popular term. But there's a difference. The way Montgomery described walk-ins, they were advanced entities coming in to help out the person or to help out humanity by bringing it's a more advanced knowledge to the world, and that's not what we see in these cases. That's why I prefer not to call them walk-ins, and to avoid that connotation.
Sure.
But for me, as far as we know, this is a phenomenon that has always occurred. There is, in fact, a Hindi term, a Sanskrit term for it, called Padakaya Pravesh, which means literally a wandering spirit taking possession of a body, which describes exactly this, and it's the term that's still used in India to describe cases like this. And of course, Sanskrit has been an extinct language for quite a long time now. So we're talking about a phenomenon then that was known
for thousands
of years. And we have documentation of it from many centuries. So it's not a current thing. As bizarre as it sounds, it seems to be something that can actually happen. And we also have cases like this documented from all over the world, from Asian and Western societies.
Well, does this in any way seem hostile to you? I mean, the illness and so on?
By and large, no. Mm-hmm. By and large, no. I have to say no. It's hard to say definitely or definitively, but it would seem, because of the association with illness, mm-hmm. it does seem as if there would be a natural exit point for one spirit mm-hmm. and for the entry point for another spirit, and then, of course, they revive. Oftentimes, they're thought to be dead. Mm-hmm. The death, they're prepared for burial or mm-hmm. cremation or something, and then they revive. Mm-hmm. There are 3 cases, though, where in last time we talked about intermission memories.
Yes.
There are 3 cases like this in which there were intermission memories. Uh-huh. And so intermission memories are the memories of the interval between death and rebirth.
Yes.
So that is memories of what happened mm-hmm. After they died and how they came mm-hmm. to possess the new body.
Well, that would be fascinating.
And in none of those 3 cases do they talk about having forcibly removed
How
another
do
spirit.
they describe it?
In different ways in all 3. Mm-hmm. In one of them, and this is a case described by Ian Stevenson in his classic book, 20 Cases Suggestive yes. of Reincarnation, the case of Jasbir. Jasbir took sick and seemed to die, then revived, claiming to be another person entirely, mm-hmm. Soparam, yep. who said that he had died during a wedding procession between villages. He had fallen off a chariot after having been given what he thought was poisoned candy, poisoned sweets by someone. He thought he had been poisoned, and that's
yes.
what caused him to fall off. Mm-hmm. Well, he said after that he was met by a holy man mm-hmm. who escorted him. And if you recall from what we talked about last time, yeah. There's often an assistant, the guide, mm-hmm. or an assistant to the rebirth also, mm-hmm. a guide, and then an mm-hmm. assisted rebirth. And that's what happened in this case.
So the holy man said, well, here's...
The holy man, right, they said, come with me, and took him along, and then showed him Jasbir's body.
I see.
And led him to it. Mm-hmm. Then there's a Hungarian case mm-hmm. Where there was, again, a replacement, mm-hmm. this time of a teenager, not with illness, but actually during a mediumistic seance. Mm-hmm. Who took over the body, but said that the last thing that she remembered, she was floating happily in space. She was quite happy to have died. Mm-hmm. And then she didn't know what had happened, but all of a sudden she woke up in this new body, younger body. Uh-huh. And she was happy to be in the younger body, yeah. but she had no idea of how she got there. Uh-huh. But once in that body, again, identified herself as the previous person, mm-hmm. acted like that person. The subject of the case began to have new skills, cooking skills, dancing skills. Mm-hmm. She said that she was a charwoman from Madrid, and, mm-hmm. She acted the part.
So this must be stressful for the family to have your child get sick and then all of a sudden act as if it's another person.
Yes, it must be. One can hardly begin to imagine what it must be like to the family. Mm-hmm. And
do the researchers report about this?
Yes,
mm-hmm.
They do. Mm-hmm. There was in one case, one of the best described of cases of this sort, Sumitra Singh, actually occurred when Sumitra was already married. Mm-hmm. She was still young, still a teenager, but she was already married, mm-hmm. and had children, mm-hmm. and appeared to die. And another spirit then came in, somebody recently deceased. In all of these cases also, the possessing spirit, the replacing reincarnation possessing spirit, had died only very recently.
So the interval is quite short.
The interval is quite short. Mm-hmm. And the death was, in all these cases, definitely after the birth mm-hmm. of of the case subject.
And in this case, Sumitra, as you say, was a teenager.
Was a teenager already.
Yeah.
Yes, so it was very definitely older. She didn't know her husband, and didn't recognize her child.
Yeah.
She later came to accept, still insisting that she was not Sumitra, that she was Shiva. She later came to accept her husband and accept her child, but she really wasn't happy, and actually left the town and went, I believe it was to Delhi.
Because there could be issues of social class and things of that sort of.
And typically there are in these cases.
Yeah.
And there were in this case. In fact, one of the interesting features of this case is that Sumitra could not write well. Her penmanship was very poor and was basically illiterate. Whereas Shiva was much better educated, wrote very well, had written, letters and postcards, and she continued to do that after she took over. Now, her penmanship was not quite up to the level of Shiva's of the past life, but it was much improved over Sumitra's.
Now, they were able to identify the past life and actually compare penmanship.
Yes.
Now, I mean, that's a whole other interesting angle here.
Isn't it? Yes. In all these cases, except for the last one I mentioned, the Hungarian case, the previous person wasn't identified there. That's an unsolved case. All the rest of them are solved. And on the basis of what the children, not the children or adults, or what the case subjects say after the possession, after the replacement takes place. They say enough, they give enough names, they remember enough of the previous life that person can be traced and identified.
Which is, for benefit of viewers who haven't watched our previous interviews, that's what you mean by a solved case.
That's what I mean by a solved case.
Yeah.
And, and so in all respects, except for the replacement aspect of it, they look exactly like other reincarnation cases that we've studied.
In other words, for you, reincarnation itself is a form of possession.
Right, exactly. And I think that's as I think of it, that's what makes the most sense to me. And people ask naturally, well, does that mean that in these replacement cases they're replacing another soul in the body? Well, yes, it does seem that way. But because of the illness, it doesn't seem like they're necessarily forcibly displacing it.
Well, I'm guessing that at this point in time, we don't have cases where a person remembers a past lifetime in which they were replaced. We never hear from the other spirits
no.
so far.
And we don't, no, so far we have not. And we haven't, and they might not know that they were replaced. They might not just think that they had died early.
Yeah.
Okay, so they may remember a previous life, but not even be aware of the fact that after they thought they had died, their body was taken over by another spirit and continued on.
Well, I can imagine, for what it's worth, that 50 or 100 years from now, if people are watching this video, they may have a much larger database to draw upon and could begin to make more finely tuned inferences based on the data that will be available in the future.
And these because our data really are limited now, and we can only generalize so far from them. We can make predictions, though, and see if those predictions are borne out by data that's collected later.
Now, well, with regard to possession, have you made predictions?
No, not any precise ones. But I mean, we can generalize from the things that I've said, and make and those generalizations, in a sense, can become, predictions.
Do you have an example?
You're putting me on the spot now, Jeff, because I haven't thought about this. I haven't thought it through, and I don't know what my answer would be exactly. But I guess, certainly in these cases, I mean, one can say that one can take the fact that they're generally associated with illness to say that is an aspect, that is something that one would expect to find.
So you could say in the future, if we can get a statistically large enough number of such cases,
we would expect. Now, it's not that you always find the illness, but you generally do.
Yeah.
So you can say that that is something we would look for in these cases. That, you know, and if we continue to see it, it becomes, it becomes
part of the syndrome.
Right. It becomes a part of it. We can then definitely say it's part of the syndrome. Now we can hypothesize that it is, and we can confirm that hypothesis through the study of cases that are collected later.
There's one case that you've referred to in the literature, not necessarily the parapsychological literature, but observed by a Westerner of a case, as I recall, in Tibet, in which it seemed as if a form of possession of the kind we're discussing was deliberately inculcated through some sort of ritual practice.
Yes, this is one of the most crazy cases in a phenomenon that's already pretty wild. Yes, and it's a practice that actually apparently goes back some time in Tibet of either a political leader or a religious leader intentionally becoming reincarnated by replacing the spirit of in a body already living. And in this case, the one that was observed by the Frenchman, a young boy was chosen, it's said, by the help of astrologers and magicians.
I see.
It was said to be the correct vehicle,
the recipient
of the correct body for the new incarnation of this Lama. And so the Lama, the boy was placed on a bier beside the embalmed body of the Lama.
Embalming is a little unusual in Tibet.
At any rate, the case describes it as an embalmed body. Right. So I don't, but anyway, placed on the bier at the knees of the body. Both were covered with a sheet, and the boy was heard to utter a cry, and then got up. Claiming to be the Lama, appeared to recognize, appeared in all aspects to be the Lama and not the boy anymore.
He was tested.
He was then tested. I mean, so the personality, he had the personality of the Lama. He seemed to be the Lama. And he was then tested in the way that incarnations are tested in Tibet, by seeing if he could pick out, the correct possessions, and he did. That's the test.
I see. And what presumably happened at that point to the spirit of the boy?
Well, nothing is said about that. And as we said earlier, we don't really have much information on what happens to the spirit that's been replaced.
Well, it certainly does suggest that there's something to be learned here by studying the Tibetan traditions further.
Well, yes, it does. It really does.
I do know that there's one potential case that might signify an example of a hostile possession.
Yes, and not only that, and it's also an example of what we can call prenatal reincarnation, replacement reincarnation. That is, that it occurred, if my interpretation of this case is correct, it occurred when the mother was 6 months along in her pregnancy.
Yes. So
at the end of the second trimester, beginning of the third, when she interestingly became very sick. She suddenly became sick at the beginning of her third trimester, had not been sick up until that point. The father of the boy, the boy who remembered the life of the previous person, the one who may have replaced a spirit who had been in the body up until that point, thought the boy had been born at a certain date. There's no birth certificate in this case, unfortunately, so we don't have a firm, definite birth date. But the father's memory of his birth placed it 3 months before the death of the person that the case subject later began to talk about. Right. And he said enough, is typical of these cases, for that person to be identified.
A past life identification. In other words, a solved case.
It became a solved case. And when the investigator, Antonia Mills in this case, the boy was born with birthmarks. We've talked about birthmarks before.
Yes, we've done a whole interview on birthmarks and the physical signs of
reincarnation. Yeah. So birthmarks are common in these cases.
Yes.
Well, the case subject of this particular case, Titu Singh, was born with a number of birthmarks, with a series of birthmarks on the back of his neck, and one on his forehead, and then another right behind his ear, which is actually a minor birth defect right behind the ear. And the family had assumed that these birthmarks were related to the previous person.
Yes.
But when Antonia Mills began to investigate the case, she went back and got hold of the autopsy report of the previous person, which showed the location of the death wounds. It turned out that he had been something of a gangster.
Yes.
And had been murdered by another gang member, by a member of a rival gang, who had shot him in the head.
Yes.
And at the location of one of the birthmarks that Tito had. And the bullet had exited behind his ear. Now, the birth family, the parents had not noticed the birthmark behind the ear. But when Antonia Mills noticed this, she went back to Titu, looked behind his ear, and sure enough, there was a bony protrusion there, right behind the ear, the earlobe, that would mark the exit wound for the bullet. I mean, this is what we see in many cases of birthmarks related to a bullet, of gunshots. There's an entry and exit wound. If those were the entry and exit wounds, that left the other birthmarks on Titu unexplained. Now,
which led you to hypothesize there might have been another spirit in the body
that was
or
replaced.
In the fetus.
That's right. Now, if we accept the father's birth date that he gave for Titu, then Titu must have taken possession of the body, and we know that we know the time of the death of the previous person.
Sure.
And that was around that time, exactly that time.
And the mother was getting ill at that time as well.
Exactly that time. So the times line up very well.
So that's about as close as you can find in the actual case history literature of reincarnation that even remotely resembles a hostile possession.
A hostile takeover, right.
Yeah.
But it does depend on accepting the father's memory of Titu's birthday, because we don't have a birth record of it.
Right. And probably a few other assumptions as well. So
right. But again, I mean, if we want to, we can take this case and take these assumptions, make them as hypotheses, and then see if later cases that are better supported match up. And then if they do, that would confirm the predictions that we make on the basis of this case.
Well, I hope that people are viewing this video 50, 100 years from now, and that they can say, yes, Jim, we've done that.
Well, I hope so, too. That would be wonderful. Yes.
Jim Matlock, once again, a fascinating discussion.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being here, and I'm very happy to
I'm glad to be with you as well. Thank you for being with me. And thank you for being with us.